Those of you who have long memories may recall the times when there was something on a Sunday afternoon television called the Brains Trust, an occasion when eminent thinkers debated matters of religion and morality and politics and so on. And I vividly remember a debate between the philosopher A.J. Ayer and the famous Jesuit apologist Father Martin Darcy on the existence of the devil. And what surprised me was the fact that Ayer, who of course didn't agree with Darcy, was nonetheless quite prepared to accept that Darcy could base some of his argument upon authority, namely the authority of his church. Well, those were humane and gentle days, and the current attack on Christianity takes rather harsher forms. And in these attacks on Christianity, the Old Testament seems to function as one of the witnesses for the prosecution. The argument being Christians accept or believe in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is awful. Its God is cruel. Therefore, Christian belief cannot be taken seriously. And as I say in paragraph 1 on the handout, one might justify these lectures on the grounds that if you become more familiar with some parts of the Old Testament that you didn't know very much about before, at least you will be in a better position to judge whether the attacks upon the Old Testament are fair or not. But more importantly, and this is paragraph 2 on the handout, the Old Testament illuminates and is illuminated by recent discussions about the nature of justice. Now, nobody can talk seriously about the subject of justice without mentioning the name of John Rawls, the American political philosopher whose writings have dominated discussions about justice for the past 40 years and have provoked many papers and lectures and books of agreement or disagreement. And if you look at paragraph 2 on the handout, under A and B, I've written there 2 points that Rawls makes in defense of his view that we must define justice as fairness. So 2A, each person has an equal right to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which is compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for all. And B, social and economic inequalities are to satisfy 2 conditions. First, they must be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Second, they must be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. And I suppose looking at 2b, one could say that one of the strengths of that is that they wouldn't give much sanction to the fact that a heart surgeon can earn salary-wise only a fraction of what somebody can who plays football in the Premier League. And one can think of golfers. I hesitate and suppress the temptation to say the word bankers. But what we have in Rawls is an attempt to arrive at a conception of justice that is based upon reason. And of course that is no bad thing. I'm a great supporter of the need to use reason, to come therefore through reason to a definition of justice as fairness, and then ask questions about the sort of institutions in the world and in society that you need in order to make sure that this fairness is then established and carried out. And although these are ideal suggestions, they have been extremely influential in recent thinking and writing about justice. But, as I go on to say under paragraph 2, Rawls's ideas have been very strongly challenged recently by the Indian Nobel Prize winner for economics, Amartya Sen, in this large book, The Idea of Justice, which appeared in the year 2009. And in this book, The Idea of Justice, Sen uses two Sanskrit words, both of which are translated as justice, niti and nyaya, if that's how you pronounce them. I'm not a Sanskrit scholar. And he sees an important distinction between these two words. I mean, in his own words here, the first, this is niti, refers to, quote, organizational propriety and behavioral correctness, and the second to, quote, a comprehensive concept of realized justice. Now, as I understand it, what he's really saying is this. There are two ways of going about trying to understand what justice is. The first way, Rawls's way, is to use reason to try to work out some theory of justice as fairness, and then to think what sort of institutions there should be to sustain this. So you start off from the point of view of reason, trying to get to a definition. The other way, nyaya, is what we might call more situational. It is to look at societies and ask, well, are they fair? To look at outcomes of things and say, are these outcomes fair? And this might be illustrated, perhaps not very well, by something that has happened today. I gather that the Welfare Reform Bill has passed into enacted legislation. And you'll remember that the Welfare Reform Bill puts a cap of £26,000 on the amount of money that any family can have that is living with benefits. And the argument is that it is not fair for a family that is not working to have a greater income than the average wage of those who are working. And that seems to me to be a nice instance of niti. But the people who have unsuccessfully, as it happens, opposed this idea, have pointed to certain outcomes and other things that have to be taken into consideration. For example, the cost of housing, rents of people who are on benefits living in certain parts of London. And the point is, it would be quite unfair to say that these people should move to cheaper parts of the country, assuming that they could find suitable houses. What about uprooting the children from their education? And so on and so forth. In other words, these particular arguments that haven't actually in the event prevailed seem to me to be an instance of nyaya, trying to say, look, but let's look at the outcomes, let's see what it does to people, and see whether what it does to people is actually fair. Now, this, of course, oversimplifies a tremendously complicated subject and a matter of discussion. But it shows, by way of illustration, what these two ideas are about. Niti, which is perhaps the Rawls approach, and nyaya, which is what Sen advocates. And one of the points I want to make is that when we start looking at the Old Testament, we see that it takes a definite side, that it is much on the side of nyaya rather than niti, that the idea of justice, as I see it in the Old Testament, is situational, in the sense that it looks at outcomes, it looks at circumstances, and it asks the question, what is fair and just, and what can be made to be more fair and just. So I come on in paragraph 3 to talk about the Hebrew word which we often translate in our English Bibles as justice, the Hebrew word mishpat. And it comes from a verbal stem shafat, which means to decide, to make a judgment, to discriminate, and so on. And in Hebrew, if you put an M, a meme, on the front of a verbal stem, it often, in the first instance, refers to a place. So there is the Hebrew verb kum, which means to rise up. You put a meme on the front and turn it into makom, and that becomes a place where you stand or rise up. So shafat, to judge, mishpat, the place where you judge. But from there, mishpat comes to mean, and I've listed some of these on the handout under paragraph 3, the act of judging, the place of judging, the process of judging, the decision or sentence, an ordinance, custom, right, privilege, manner, or fitness. Now, of course, the English word justice does have non-legal senses. We talk about doing justice to something, don't we? But I think I'm right in saying that mishpat in Hebrew has a much, much wider range of meaning than the English word justice. Mishpat often occurs with the word tzedakah, meaning righteousness or vindication. And I've referred you to Psalm 103 verse 6. In the Authorized Version, the Lord executeth righteousness and judgment for all that are oppressed, or as the New Jerusalem version has, Yahweh acts with uprightness, with justice to all who are oppressed. And I think if you look at the RSV, instead of righteousness, it says vindication. The Lord works vindication and justice for all who are oppressed. And I think you get from that the sense that these words, righteousness and justice in Hebrew, are sort of action words. They're things that are done rather than definitions of static things. And to say that God works righteousness, that's vindication and justice for those who are oppressed, suggests an openness. There is a situation of being oppressed. What needs to be done, and the hope and prayer of the psalmist is that God sees these things and acts appropriately. But I've gone on to mention this extremely important passage in Genesis 18:22 to 33, in which Abraham asks the question, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And our Hebrew words come here. Shall not the judge, the shofet of all the earth do right, do mishpat? Let me remind you of the setting of this saying. It is to do with the destruction by God of Sodom and Gomorrah. And here we are, if we're not careful, with one of those bits of the Old Testament that people say is awful and cruel. You know, this city, God is going to destroy this city. But hang on. A very sophisticated discussion goes on between Abraham and God before Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. And Abraham says to God, look, surely, suppose there are righteous people living in the city. Is it right that you should destroy the innocent together with the wicked? And God says, well, no, you've got a point there. If there are 50 righteous people there, I won't destroy it. Abraham comes out, but supposing there are 40, so I won't destroy it for 40. Supposing there, and it goes down to 10. Supposing there are 10, I won't destroy it for the sake of 10. Now, I think that is very important because, first of all, there is much more dialogue about the legal and moral issues that goes on in the Old Testament than people realise. Some years ago I published a couple of papers on discourse ethics taken from the German political philosopher Jürgen Habermas, and pointing out the extent to which you have in the Old Testament discourse going on ethical matters, and this is a very important passage here. And it is situational, you see. Okay, there is a principle that wickedness should be punished. Yet, in applying that principle, you have to look at the situation and you have to say, but what is fair in this situation? And God agrees that it would be unfair in this situation to destroy innocent people along with wicked people. Now, unfortunately, this passage and the discussion has terrible resonance today. At the moment in the Syrian city of Homs, a bombardment is going on because the government is wanting to suppress an armed revolt, and in the process innocent people are being killed. Yet if you were listening this morning to the Today programme early on as I was, you may have heard somebody pointing out to John Humphreys not justifying the Syrians, but pointing out that what they are doing is exactly what the Americans did when they were trying to remove armed insurgents from Fallujah in Iraq. The Americans used the same weapons, the same tactics. They bombarded a town full of civilians in which there were insurgents that they needed to root out. So where are we? Where is the morality? Should one destroy the innocent with the wicked? Is it right to bombard civilian targets in the year 2001 or 2011? Because among the civilians there are people you deem to be enemies. And of course one thinks again of the atrocities during the Second World War, where the whole principle of collective guilt was imposed by the Germans or the Nazis upon villages where there were collaborators or patriots or whatever. So this is a text which for me is a tremendously relevant and telling text. And even though it is then followed by what may seem to us to be the barbarous story of God raining down fire and brimstone on the wicked towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, we mustn't overlook the profound and subtle moral discussion that goes on in the text before that. Now I come on to the next Hebrew word, the Hebrew word for law, which is Torah, paragraph 4 on the handout. Torah comes from a Hebrew stem, verbal stem, which means to teach, yarah. And so it has the sense of instruction, teaching. And most significantly, it stands for the first 5 books of the Bible. The first 5 books of the Bible are the Torah. And of course, the first 5 books of the Bible contain law or laws, and I shall be talking about 3 groups of them in lectures 3, 4 and 5. But the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is a narrative. And that narrative is partly, in fact one might say mainly, about God electing a particular people to be a blessing to the nations. And the law is given to that people so that they may live as God wishes, and in so doing may be a blessing to other people. We must remember that when it comes to something like the 10 Commandments, there are 3 ways of numbering the 10 Commandments. And for the Jewish tradition, the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And so these commandments are immediately put in the context of a story of God forming a people by delivering them from slavery. It's in the context of that story that the commandments that follow are to be understood. That means there is a very close personal link between the laws in the Old Testament and the God whose grace and mercy has brought into being his special people with a view to them being a blessing to the nations. And I've mentioned on the handout, of course, the famous passage in Micah, which says, shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, shall be raised up above the hills, people shall flow to it, and many nations shall come and say, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples and decide for strong nations afar off. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. There is therefore this tremendously focused purpose for the laws in the Old Testament. And when I was thinking about this, it made me ask myself the question, now, how do I understand the laws of the country in which I live? I mean, what are they there for? What is their purpose? What are they trying to do? Whose interests are they trying to serve? Well, I leave that as an open question for us all to think about. But I think it's not unfair to comment on the fact that for us, laws don't appear to be anchored in a particular story, a story of saving history. But if we are Christians, we are part of that saving history taken over from the Old Testament given to us by our Lord Jesus Christ. And therefore we have to ask ourselves whether as Christians laws can or should be placed within the context of an understanding of ourselves as within the context of saving history. Now, this personal sort of link between laws and God has all sorts of ramifications. And as I have said at the bottom of number 4, to violate the law is not to offend against an abstract principle derived from human reason. It is to offend against God himself. And I've quoted there Exodus 22:21 to 24, because again we have one of those passages that you can cite as evidence for the awful, wrathful God of the Old Testament, and yet when you read it, it may appear in a different light. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you do afflict them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn. And I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Okay, that begs the question, is there the punishment of the innocent with the wicked? The Old Testament is not consistent any more than I am. But you can see where it comes from. It comes from a desire that there should be justice and fairness for precisely those people, widows and orphans, least able to protect themselves and least protected by the structures of the society. Okay, point 5 on the handout. There is an important and close connection in the Old Testament between justice and wisdom as exemplified in the story of Solomon's judgment. You'll remember that 2 prostitutes come to Solomon, and they are squabbling over who should have a child who has just been born. And one woman says, look, during the night of that woman she lay on her child and killed it. And having killed it, she then substituted the child for mine. And she's now claiming that my child is hers and it's the other way around. And the other woman says, no, this is not true at all. There was no such killing and substituting. And you'll remember that Solomon orders a sword to be brought and says, right, cut the child down the middle. One can have one half, the other can have the other half. At which point, of course, the woman who is the genuine mother of the child says, no, don't do that, give it to the other woman. And Solomon knows which is the true mother and therefore how to act. Again, you see this idea that justice to some extent depends upon wisdom and insight, takes us beyond reason into judging the situation, doing what is fair in the situation. And within the Old Testament, the ability to do that, wisdom, is regarded as a gift from God. So we come on to point 6 on the handout. The Old Testament is well aware of the misuse of law and justice and strongly denounces it. Deuteronomy 19:15 to 21, which I have referred to, is interesting because again we have in it a passage which is usually cited as evidence for the cruel and harsh Old Testament. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand. foot for foot. But what is the context here? The context is the deliberate perversion of justice. It is the deliberate lying. It is the deliberate attempt that someone who is innocent should be convicted of a crime and punished for it. And this is what the law says. A single witness shall not prevail against a man for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offence that he has committed. On the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be sustained. And I'll say something more about that in a moment. If a malicious witness rises against any man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused to his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. And then, at the end of that, therefore comes the business of eye for eye, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. In other words, if because of false evidence the innocent person would have been sentenced to death, the false witness must suffer the same. If it was the putting out of an eye, then the false witness must have the same. In other words, this somewhat barbaric sort of injunction, makes sense in a society where it's important that there should not be the perversion of justice, because we know, unfortunately, only too well from recent cases in our own history, how justice is perverted, how people lie in court, and how can any society run justly and fairly when people will not be honest in giving evidence and giving evidence on oath. In Psalm 94, and the whole of Psalm 94 is important here, there is a telling verse. It's verse 20 or 21, Psalm 94, 20 and 21. Can wicked rulers be allied with thee, who frame mischief by statute? Can wicked rulers be allied with thee, who frame mischief by statute? And there's another passage in Jeremiah where it talks about the lying pen of the scribes. And it is reflecting a situation here where the law is being written down and promulgated, a law which is unjust. And the psalmist is recognizing this and saying, God, look, God, people who do that cannot be allied to you. That cannot be right. And so finally we come to, at the bottom of the handout, the story of Susanna in the so-called Apocrypha, in the additions to Daniel. And again, in case you're not familiar with the story of Susanna, I'll remind you of it. There are actually two slightly differing versions in the manuscript tradition. But Susanna is a ravishing young maiden, and 2 elderly men, in one tradition they are judges, lust after her. She refuses their advances, and they decide to take their revenge on her by saying, and there are 2 of them, that they saw her commit adultery with a young man. And that is, of course, enough under Old Testament law to condemn her to death, although as time went on, actually, historically in Judaism, adultery was not increasingly taken to be something for stoning to death, but by the time you get to New Testament times, it had become a ground for divorce rather than stoning to death, although somebody might ask me about John chapter 8 in the questions. So along comes Daniel in answer, in one of the versions, to the prayer of Susanna to God that she may have justice. And Daniel, remember, then cross-questions the 2 witnesses, and separately, you have to do that, you question them separately, and proves that their evidence is contradictory. and that they are false witnesses, and thereby is Susanna saved from the plot of the two people who had lusted after her. But the Old Testament takes tremendously seriously any attempt to pervert the course of justice, not because, as it would just be with us, that makes the society rotten and something that you can't rely on, but because to pervert the course of justice is an affront to the God who gives his laws to his people, that his people in those laws may reflect God's character and through that be a blessing to the nations. Well, I leave it to you to decide whether that has begun to put the Old Testament in a slightly different light from those who describe it as awful and cruel. Perhaps you may begin to see that there is a lot more to this than meets the eye. I hope this sort of taster will have encouraged you to come for the next 4 weeks. And thank you for coming this evening.